Welcome to week 5. Today we're talking about one of the most difficult objections to the Christian faith, in the sense that it's difficult to grasp the arguments, and yet there are simple answers to this difficult question, and that's a question of miracles. If you've ever had someone ask you, how can a miracle occur, or to object by simply saying miracles can't occur, they have often built their argument on an 18th century Scottish philosopher named David Hume. And I want to lay out for you basically Hume's argument against miracles and then how we answer that. This is one of the most significant objections to the Christian faith, because if miracles are ruled out, then of course the centerpiece of the Christian faith, the resurrection of Jesus, is also ruled out. So I want to give credit to a friend and former student, Tim Miller, for this summary of critique of Hume's miracles, and it's mostly his work I'm drawing from. David Hume made several arguments against miracles, but I want to basically capture the essence of his argument. First of all, he says a miracle is by definition a rare occurrence. Secondly, he would say natural law is by definition a description of regular occurrence. Thirdly, the evidence for the regular is always greater than that for the rare. Fourthly, evidences must be weighed. Fifthly, a wise man always bases his belief on the greater evidence. Sixthly, therefore, a wise man should never believe in a miracle. In other words, Hume basically argues that miracles cannot happen because they violate the laws of nature, and laws of nature simply can't be violated. Hume could pose this in the sense of we should not expect that if someone tells us they jumped off a building and gravity didn't come into effect and they floated to the ground, then we shouldn't believe them. Hume would say because gravity is a law of nature, therefore we shouldn't believe such testimony. I want to read some of Hume's own words in his arguments against miracle. He first of all says we shouldn't believe in miracles because the requirements needed for a witness to be credible simply can never be met. He says this: first, there is not to be found in all of history any miracle attested by a sufficient number of men of such unquestioned good sense, education, and learning as to secure us against all delusion in themselves, of such undoubted integrity as to place them beyond all suspicion of any design to deceive others, of such credit and reputation in the eyes of mankind as to have a great deal to lose in case of their being detected in any falsehood, and at the same time attesting facts performed in such a public manner and in so celebrated a part of the world as to render the detection unavoidable. All which circumstances are requisite to give us a full assurance in the testimony of men. In other words, Hume sets up a requirement for any eyewitness of a miracle to be of such a type of person, and for the miracle to occur in such a place by such a number of people that it couldn't be doubted. And Hume basically says we have no record of such an event taking place. So he basically gives two requirements. The first has to do with the witness. In other words, in order to have his testimony accepted, the witness has to be educated, truthful, reputable, and must have something to lose if found deceptive. And secondly, the witness must testify to facts that were publicly witnessed in a reputable city. Unless every one of these conditions is met, a wise man does not have to accept the testimony. So you see, Hume's first point here is simply that we don't have the right kind of people witnessing these supposed miracles. His second argument is about the instability of the human mind. Hume claims that humans must base their acceptance of truth on past experiences. Those things closest to past experience are considered more probable than those least like our past experiences. Thus, miracles should never be accepted. However, Hume notes that the mind does not always accord with this rule, that is, people act irrationally. Instead of affirming what has been experienced, the human mind tends toward the miraculous. Hume says this, quote, "The passion of surprise and wonder arising from miracles, being an agreeable emotion, gives a sensible tendency towards the belief of those events from which it is derived," unquote. In other words, humans tend to accept fanciful stories simply because they are fanciful. Even those who do not allow their reason to go astray by believing the absurd propagate absurd claims anyway in love of the fanciful. Basically, Hume is saying here that people love amazing stories and surprise. Therefore, we tend to believe miracles because we want to experience wonder in this world. Point number 3, the source of miraculous stories is the basis of Hume's third argument. He maintains that miracles and supernatural manifestations are always found to originate in ignorant and barbarous populations. These curious stories may be found outside these populations, but only after they originated from such a situation and were passed along to modernized society. In other words, Hume says we don't have stories of this in the modern world by educated people. And Hume assumes that people prior to the Enlightenment, prior to the 17th century, simply lived in a barbarous age. They couldn't tell the difference between truth and deception, between charlatans and speakers of truth, and therefore they were more likely given toward belief in miracles because of their innate belief in the supernatural or God or gods. And Hume commits the error that C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery. Chronological snobbery is simply the idea that we are smarter than people in the past. The people in the past were gullible. They believed supernatural ideas and myths so easily. And Hume falls prey to that in this argument. Fourthly, Hume's final argument notes the multiplicity of miraculous testimony. Each testimony, inasmuch as it contradicts the claims of other miracle testimonies, brings disrepute on human testimony as a whole and on the particular stories themselves. So he says this, quote, "Every miracle, therefore, pretended to have been wrought in any of these religions, as its direct scope is to establish the particular system to which it is attributed, so it has the same force to overthrow every other system," unquote. In other words, if a miracle is proved, then the wise have an obligation to weigh the evidence of one miracle against another. Basically, Hume says in this argument, if we accept miracles, then we are stuck with having to judge between competing claims that miracles have taken place. So what do we do with Hume's critique of miracles? Well, there are a number of ways that we can answer those, and I think in your reading you'll come across those, but let me give you a few ways to answer those who question miracles. First of all, Hume only allows testimonial evidence in favor of miracles. In other words, he thinks that we need a certain number of highly educated Western modern people in order to confirm a miracle. And what he doesn't take into consideration is that when a miracle occurs, there can be residual circumstantial evidence in favor of that event. Ronald Nash, the philosopher, gives an example. He says residents on vacation during a catastrophe do not have to take the testimony of others concerning the tornado which devastated their home simply because they were in their basements. They can walk outside after the tornado and see the results. And one of the arguments for the miracles that we see in the Bible is the result of the miracle. The classic example is the resurrection of Jesus. How else do we explain that a ragtag group of followers who were in fear of the authorities, who ran when Jesus was arrested, who some of them denied that they knew him, doubted after the resurrection? Think about Thomas, who doubts unless he says he can put his fingers in the hands of Jesus or thrust his hand into the side of Jesus. Thomas was a radical empiricist. And even at the ascension of Jesus in Matthew 28, some still don't believe. How do we explain that group of people suddenly beginning to turn the world upside down? In other words, the residual effects of the miracle, the resurrection of Jesus, is the only logical explanation for what the disciples did in the months and years following Jesus' resurrection and ascension to heaven. Another argument against Hume is that, once again, Hume says we should believe in those events which are common, and those events which are rare should be regarded skeptically. But think about this. Patients who've been diagnosed with ultra-rare diseases should also believe their doctor, since the chance of the doctor being wrong is greater than the chance of having the disease. And yet if you go to a doctor and tests are run, generally we accept the fact that the doctor is correct in this. Norman Geisler, the apologist, says this, quote, "What Hume seems to overlook is that wise people base their belief on facts, not simply on odds. Hume's argument confuses quantity of evidence with the quality of evidence," unquote. Therefore, while it may be true that wise people base their beliefs on the greater evidence, Hume has missed the point that evidence weighs differently. People do not proportion their belief to probability, and any theory based on such an antiquated notion fails to convince. Here's another argument against Hume's critique. The philosopher Colin Brown says this: "The qualifications that Hume demands of such witnesses are such that no one before the modern Western time could ever serve as a witness. It appears that Hume's requirements are a product of a bias toward his modern Western education." A second answer along this lines is that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus was not done in a corner. Hume assumes that miracles never take place in a publicly visible way. And yet when you look at the events surrounding Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, very clearly they take place in the Roman Empire during the first century on a grand stage where Romans and Jewish leaders are all eyewitnesses to the death of Jesus and then have to clean up the mess after his resurrection, trying to somehow make excuses for why the body was missing. Finally, one of the best objections to Hume and one of the best answers for this question of miracles comes from C.S. Lewis. If you've never read his book Miracles, let me warn you, it's a challenging read. Lewis demonstrates in this book that he's one of the top philosophers of his day in the mid-20th century. But Lewis devastates Hume's arguments by showing all the assumptions that Hume makes that he simply doesn't prove. We call that in logic begging the question. In other words, Hume assumed things that he should have been trying to prove. So in his work, Miracles, Lewis sought to show the deficiencies of naturalism. Hume basically argues naturalism, that we can only believe that natural processes exist, that we don't need to believe in a designer who created the world and put reason and rationality in the world. Lewis has three objections to that argument. Lewis notes that there are at least three things that you cannot explain if naturalism is true. First of all is reason. Naturalism asserts that nature is all that exists. Reason then must be explained by nature, but nature is ultimately non-rational. In addition, Lewis rightly notes that rationality cannot be derived from the non-rational. Now what that simply means is, if all that exists is nature, and there is no divine intelligence in the universe, no intelligent personal God who has made us in his image, who has made us rational beings, where we would even get the notion of rationality to begin with. Or how rationality, that is our ability to think critically, to be self-aware, and things like that, where would that even come from if the beginnings of life were purely mechanistic, naturalistic process? There's no way that naturalism could ever result in reason. Secondly, Lewis notes that without God, morality is impossible. The non-moral cannot give rise to moral. That is, if nature is all there is, and there is no God, no intelligence, everything came about through time and chance, where do we get the idea of morality? Why are we outraged when injustice is done? Why do we grieve when bad things happen and we lose those that we love? Why do we feel that someone who exploits another person is wrong? Why do we almost universally object to things like human trafficking, racism, genocide? Where does that come from? Because if we are just the product of the natural world, then we should see that kind of thing in nature too. But on the Serengeti, when a lion takes down a zebra, there's no remorse. That is, why is it that we as humans feel a sense of rationality? Well, simply speaking, Hume's naturalism cannot result in that. It makes no sense. Thirdly, Lewis notes that If there is no God, if there is no designer, sustainer of the universe, we should not expect uniformity. That is, Hume argued that we can't even know for sure if the sun will rise tomorrow because just because it happened yesterday doesn't mean it will be happening tomorrow. And on this point, Hume was right. If there is no God, we have no reason to expect that the universe will continue the way it has been. And yet we must assume that to do science. We must assume that in order to live day by day. And Lewis points out the fact that without a God, we should not expect the universe to be uniform, because naturalism believes that things come about through time and chance. And chance cannot produce a universe which operates in a normal, uniform manner. Lewis provides the best answer to these questions. He compares God's creation to poetry. Poetry, he says, contains many laws by which the wise poet will submit his arrangement. When submitted to these laws, the poem will have unity, clarity, and forcefulness. However, sometimes an experienced poet will vary from these laws. Elementary poets will critique the experienced poet for his apostasy from the traditional law. Other experienced poets, however, will recognize the place in which the poet abandoned the law is the central point of the poem. That is, the experienced poet abandoned the law in order to draw attention to the point of interest. When the experienced poet abandoned the law, he did so to bring greater unity to the poem as a whole. And Lewis concluded his analogy this way, quote, "By definition, miracles must of course interrupt the usual course of nature." And that's a very important distinction. Hume and skeptics today talk about the laws of nature. And Lewis challenged that and said the problem is you are imagining the uniform way that nature typically acts as a law that can't be broken. But he says that's an assumption that you cannot make. Miracles interrupt the usual course of nature, but if they are real, they must, in the very act of so doing, assert all the more the unity and self-consistency of total reality at some deeper level. They will not be like unmetrical lumps of prose breaking the unity of a poem. They'll be like that crowning metrical audacity, which, though it may be unparalleled nowhere else in the poem, yet coming just where it does and affecting just what it affects, is, to those who understand, the supreme revelation of the unity in the poet's conception. Unquote. So basically, he argues miracles are nothing more than God's intervention in the world in a different way than he normally acts. God's interventions are not arbitrary or random, rather they are the focal point of history. When you think about miracles, for example, in the Bible, there are only 3 concentrated periods in which miracles occur. They occur in the Exodus when Moses leads Egypt out of Israel. They occur during the times of Elijah and Elisha, and they occur in the days of Jesus. Miracle, by definition in the Bible, is a supernatural event intended to, accomplished, or performed for the purpose of validating a spokesman of God. That's one of the reasons why, as Christians, we need to be so careful not to call everything that happens a miracle. In fact, I don't call anything that happens today a miracle. Is birth a supernatural event? Well, it's natural. God designed the world to be that way. And for a life to come into being is a wonderful thing that truly is upheld by the sovereign hands of God. But miracles in the Bible were events that transcended normal laws of nature in order to authenticate that Moses was the spokesperson for God, Elijah and Elisha were the prophets of God, and that Jesus was the Son of God. As Christians, sometimes we muddle things by calling what God has put into place, the glory and beauty of nature, miracles. So we need to be careful, because that can harm us apologetically if we do not acknowledge that the miracle of the resurrection, for example, is of a whole different sort of event than even when a person becomes a believer, comes to Christ, is regenerated and transformed. That is a work of God, no doubt. but it is not a miracle in the technical sense in the way that the Bible speaks of miracles. So we do support miracles, we do argue for miracles, and in response to those who would argue that miracles cannot happen, our question would simply be, why are you assuming what you must prove? Why are you assuming that the laws of nature, we shouldn't even use that terminology, the normal course of nature can't be violated? If there is a God who created the world, then a miracle is nothing really too great for him. Well, I hope this has spurred your thinking. There's much more that can be said. It's a complex topic, but I hope that your reading and this short discussion will help you as you think through how we answer that objection to the Christian faith.